The blinding white of the frozen sea stretched toward the horizon like death's own shroud, a barren plain where no man dared venture. Yet on this bitter morning in the depths of winter, the impossible occurred. Dark shapes emerged from the swirling mist, moving across the solid water with a speed that defied comprehension. The Saxons, who witnessed it from the shoreline monasteries, stood transfixed, unable to process what their eyes revealed. Norse warriors, dragging their dreaded longships across the ice, approaching with unmistakable purpose. It was a sight so alien, so contrary to the natural order, that many believed it heralded the end of days. This moment would forever alter how the people of Britain understood their island sanctuary, suddenly no longer protected by the winter sea. Before we begin this journey into the Viking Age, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's always fascinating to see our community of history lovers spread across the world. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications. Every subscription helps us keep exploring the real stories behind the legends. Now, let's begin. To understand the profound shock of this moment, we must first comprehend the world as the Saxons knew it. By the late 8th century, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had achieved a certain stability after centuries of migration and conflict. Christianity had taken root across the land, with monasteries serving not merely as places of worship, but as centers of learning, wealth, and community identity. The Venerable Bede's ecclesiastical history, completed just decades earlier, portrayed a land slowly emerging from chaos into order, guided by faith and the growing authority of kings who claimed divine sanction. The sea that surrounded Britain was viewed as both provider and protector, a highway for trade in summer, but in winter, when it froze along the shallower coastlines, a barrier against threats from beyond. These were people intimately connected to the rhythms of nature, their lives governed by seasonal cycles that determined planting, harvest, and the possibility of travel. For the coastal communities of Northumbria and East Anglia, winter brought a peculiar comfort. Though harsh and unforgiving, it also meant a time when raids from overseas were impossible, when fishing boats were drawn up on beaches, when the sea itself solidified into an impassable barrier. This certainty was written into their understanding of the world. The frozen sea meant safety. It was a belief so fundamental that it was rarely articulated, simply known. The Saxon calendar divided the year into two halves: summer, when the seas were navigable and vigilance was necessary, and winter, when communities could turn inward, focusing on crafts, storytelling, and religious observances. Winter festivals celebrated not just the promise of returning light, but the protective isolation that cold weather brought. In coastal monasteries, winter was a time of particular productivity, when manuscripts could be created without the interruptions of pilgrims and travelers who arrived by sea in warmer months. The rhythm of prayers changed with the seasons, with winter liturgies offering thanks for the shield of ice that God in His wisdom had provided against seaborne threats. The coastal defenses that Saxon kingdoms maintained reflected this seasonal thinking. Watchtowers stood unmanned through winter months, their garrisons reassigned to other duties or simply disbanded until spring. Beacons prepared for summer warning signals were allowed to grow damp, the wood stored rather than kept ready for lighting. Coastal paths that might be patrolled during summer were left to disappear under snowdrifts. The very concept of coastal defense was a seasonal one, activated with the spring thaws and suspended when the first ice formed along the shorelines. Far to the north, beyond this mental horizon, lived the people who would shatter this worldview. The Norse peoples occupied the challenging landscapes of Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, where narrow valleys, dense forests, and a rugged coastline created natural boundaries between communities. Their society was organized around extended family units and local assemblies called things, where free men gathered to resolve disputes and make collective decisions. Unlike the more hierarchical Saxon kingdoms, Norse communities maintained a strong tradition of individual freedom among their free farmers, though powerful jarls and eventually kings would emerge as dominant figures. Their worldview was shaped by a complex mythology centered around gods who embodied natural forces and human virtues. Odin the wise wanderer, Thor the protector with his mighty hammer, Freyr and Freya, who governed fertility and prosperity. These were not distant, perfect beings, but flawed, passionate figures, locked in constant struggle against the forces of chaos, destined to ultimate defeat in the cataclysmic battle of Ragnarok. From this cosmology emerged a value system that prized courage, honor, and reputation above all else. Death was inevitable. What mattered was how one faced it and the stories told afterward. Daily life in Norse communities was far more challenging than outsiders often appreciated. The harsh northern climate limited agricultural possibilities, with a growing season sometimes lasting barely 3 months in northern regions. Every bit of arable land was precious, carefully maintained through generations of labor. Families would spend decades clearing fields of stones, building walls and terraces on hillsides to maximize farming space. The coastal communities supplemented farming with fishing, hunting, and gathering, developing specialized knowledge of seasonal resources. When certain fish would run, which wild plants could be harvested, when game animals would be at their fattest. Nothing was wasted. Every part of plants and animals found purpose, from food to tools to clothing. Winter brought particular challenges, with some northern communities experiencing perpetual darkness for weeks. Yet, rather than viewing winter as a time of mere endurance, Norse culture embraced it as a season of possibility. Their winter technologies were sophisticated responses to environmental challenges: skis and snowshoes for mobility over deep snow, ice fishing techniques, specialized clothing of layered wool and fur that could withstand extreme conditions. Most importantly, they developed methods to maintain mobility when waterways froze, seeing ice not as a barrier, but as an alternative surface for travel. This cultural mindset produced a people remarkably adaptable to hardship and eager to seize opportunity. Living in a land where farming was difficult, where winters were long and summers short, Norse communities turned to supplementary activities: fishing, hunting, crafting, and increasingly trade and raiding. Their settlements, typically situated along fjords or coastal inlets, maintained a close relationship with the sea. Unlike many of their contemporaries who feared open water, the Norse embraced it, developing maritime skills that would eventually make them the most accomplished seafarers of their age. Archaeological evidence from Norse winter settlements reveals sophisticated adaptation to cold conditions. Houses were built with thick walls, sometimes double-layered with insulating materials between. Central hearths were designed for optimal heat distribution, with smoke channels that retained warmth while venting fumes. Underground storage chambers preserved food at consistent temperatures despite external fluctuations. Winter workshops were constructed to capture and retain both heat and light, with reflective surfaces amplifying the limited daylight of northern latitudes. These were not people who merely survived winter, but who had learned to thrive within its constraints. The social fabric of Norse communities tightened during winter months. Extended families gathered in longhouses, sharing resources and labor. The evening ritual of sitting around the central hearth, repairing equipment, while listening to sagas and stories, strengthened communal bonds and preserved cultural knowledge. Winter was when young people learned their community's history and values, when disputes were resolved through lengthy discussions, when marriages were arranged and plans made for the coming year. Far from being a time of hibernation, winter in Norse communities was a season of intense social interaction and cultural transmission. At the heart of Norse expansion lay their revolutionary shipbuilding technology. The longship represents one of history's most perfect marriages of form and function, a vessel designed specifically for the challenges of northern waters. Constructed using the clinker-built method, where wooden planks overlapped like scales, these ships combined remarkable strength with astonishing flexibility. Their shallow draft allowed navigation in rivers and close to shore, while their symmetrical design meant they could reverse direction without turning. Propelled by both sail and oars, a longship could switch between power sources as conditions demanded, making them versatile in unpredictable northern weather. The construction of these vessels was itself a marvel of precision and knowledge. Shipwrights worked without formal plans, carrying the complex geometries in their minds, guided by inherited wisdom and experience. The selection of materials was equally sophisticated. Specific types of wood chosen for different components, each with properties suited to its particular function. Keel timbers needed strength and rigidity. Planking required flexibility without brittleness. Masts demanded straight grain and resistance to splitting. Trees were carefully selected, sometimes decades before harvesting, with their growth deliberately shaped through selective trimming. The tools used in shipbuilding represented generations of refinement. Specialized axes that could shape wood with astonishing precision, adzes for smoothing surfaces, augers for drilling holes that would receive the iron rivets binding the structure together. Archaeological findings reveal these tools were often personalized, treasured possessions passed from master to apprentice, their handles worn to the contours of specific hands through years of use. The shipwright's workshop was a place where precise measurement coexisted with intuitive knowledge, where mathematics and art merged in service of seaworthiness. Archaeological findings like the Oseberg and Gokstad ships reveal vessels of surprising elegance, with graceful lines and often elaborate decoration, particularly at the stems where dragon or serpent heads might be mounted. Not mere adornment, but expressions of cultural identity and spiritual protection. A good ship was more than transportation. It was a symbol of status, a community investment, and sometimes even believed to have its own spirit. The men who crewed these vessels formed tight-knit teams, their coordination essential for survival. Through generational refinement of both vessel design and sailing techniques, the Norse achieved the maritime capabilities far beyond their contemporaries. The longship's influence extended beyond mere transportation. It shaped Norse social organization, creating the need for cooperative labor both in construction and operation. Building a vessel required contributions from specialists throughout the community: woodworkers, rope makers, weavers for the sail, metalsmiths for fittings and anchors. Operating it demanded coordinated effort from crews who might range from 20 to 60 men, depending on the vessel's size. These crews often formed the core of social units, men who trained together, fought together, and whose survival depended on mutual trust and coordination. What is often overlooked in popular accounts is the Norse mastery, not just of summer seas, but of winter conditions. Living in regions where fjords and coastal waters regularly froze, they developed methods to extend their mobility through the harshest months. They crafted specialized ice runners that could be attached to ships, transforming vessels into massive sledges. They studied ice conditions, learning to identify where frozen surfaces could bear weight and where hidden weaknesses might lead to disaster. They developed techniques for breaking through thin ice using the ship's bow, reinforced with metal fittings. When necessary, they would drag their vessels across frozen expanses using ropes and human power, a back-breaking effort that required extraordinary coordination and endurance. Winter navigation demanded specialized knowledge beyond summer sailing skills. Without the familiar landmarks visible in warmer months, Norse navigators developed techniques for orientation in the white emptiness of frozen seascapes. They learned to read subtle variations in ice coloration that might indicate underlying currents or different thicknesses. They understood how wind patterns affected snow distribution using drifting patterns as directional indicators. They developed specialized compasses that functioned in extreme cold when standard liquid-based instruments would freeze. Most importantly, they maintained detailed mental maps of coastal features that remained identifiable even when transformed by ice and snow. Distinctive cliffs, island profiles, mountain ranges visible from offshore. The specialized equipment for winter journeys was itself a testament to Norse ingenuity. Excavations at various sites have uncovered ice crampons for improved traction, specialized poles for testing ice thickness, tools designed specifically for clearing snow from ships and cutting channels through ice. Some vessels carried portable shelters that could be quickly erected on ice when conditions deteriorated, allowing crews to wait out storms rather than risking progress in dangerous conditions. Food supplies for winter expeditions were carefully prepared, high-energy provisions that wouldn't freeze solid, specialized containers that provided insulation against extreme temperatures, medicinal preparations for the particular ailments that accompanied cold weather travel. These capabilities remained largely unknown to the outside world. For centuries, the Norse had confined their maritime activities to familiar waters, fishing local seas, trading with nearby communities, occasionally raiding neighboring territories. But by the late 8th century, a complex convergence of factors was pushing them toward broader horizons. Population growth strained the limited agricultural land available in the narrow valleys of western Norway. Climate fluctuations brought both opportunity in the form of milder conditions that opened new sea routes and pressure as poor harvests in some regions created resource scarcity. Political consolidation under ambitious leaders meant that those who found themselves on the losing side of power struggles might seek fortune elsewhere. The early medieval climate optimum, a period of relatively warm conditions from approximately 800 to 1300 CE, facilitated Norse expansion in complex ways. Improved growing conditions in Scandinavia initially supported population growth, creating the demographic pressure that would eventually spur emigration. Milder winters meant less extensive sea ice in traditional sailing routes, extending the normal navigation season. Yet, paradoxically, the periods when winter ice did form became more predictable and stable, creating conditions where ice-crossing techniques could be employed with greater confidence. Climate scientists studying ice core samples from Greenland have identified several decades in the early 9th century when winter temperature patterns would have been particularly favorable for ice crossings, cold enough to form substantial ice bridges, but stable enough to avoid the rapid freeze-thaw cycles that make ice travel treacherous. Perhaps most importantly, increasing contact with trading networks that stretched across Europe had brought tantalizing knowledge of wealthy, often poorly defended communities to the south and west. Merchants returning from trading expeditions spoke of rich monasteries built near shores, of fertile lands held by people unused to warfare, of treasures gathered in centers of worship. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, having experienced relative peace for generations, had grown prosperous but complacent. Their defenses were oriented toward land-based threats, their coastal settlements vulnerable. The Saxon belief that winter brought safety from seaborne dangers would prove their undoing. The earliest Norse expeditions to Saxon shores likely occurred in the milder months, traditional raiding season, when seas were navigable by conventional means. The first documented attack came in June 793 at Lindisfarne, a holy island off the Northumbrian coast, where Vikings desecrated the monastery, slaughtered monks, and carried off treasures. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that fierce foreboding omens came over the land of Northumbria and wretchedly terrified the people. But these summer raids, shocking as they were, at least conformed to the understood patterns of threat. Communities could anticipate danger during certain months and prepare accordingly. The Lindisfarne raid sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. Alcuin of York, a leading intellectual at Charlemagne's court, wrote in horror to the Bishop of Lindisfarne, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments." This attack on a renowned center of learning and faith seemed to strike at the very foundations of the emerging Christian order in Northern Europe. The psychological impact extended far beyond the material damage, creating an atmosphere of vulnerability and divine abandonment. Over the next several decades, summer raiding became an established pattern along Britain's eastern coast. Norse expeditions followed predictable seasonal rhythms. Appearing with the spring thaws and departing before winter storms made return journeys hazardous. Saxon communities adapted to this pattern, developing early warning systems and seasonal defensive preparations. Valuable church treasures would be moved inland during summer months, returning to coastal monasteries only after the season of danger had passed. Some communities established summer militia rotations, with able-bodied men taking turns at coastal watch duties during high-risk months before returning to agricultural work. What changed everything was the discovery, or perhaps we should say, the revelation, that winter no longer guaranteed safety. The exact date of the first winter crossing remains disputed among historians, with some placing it in the early 9th century, during particularly harsh winters, when extensive sea ice formed even in southern Norse territories. Contemporary accounts are fragmentary, but the Peterborough Chronicle contains a cryptic entry describing devil men who came walking upon the frozen sea to attack settlements along the Lincolnshire coast. Similar accounts appear in ecclesiastical letters where bishops describe the horror of seeing ships dragged like serpents across the white waste. The first winter crossings were likely experimental in nature, opportunistic ventures by daring leaders testing the limits of possibility. Norse sagas, though recorded centuries later, preserve tales of these pioneers, figures like Sigurd Icewalker and Thorfinn Frozenbeard, who led the first winter expeditions. While the specific individuals may be legendary or composite figures, archaeological evidence confirms that specialized equipment for ice crossings dates to precisely this period. Excavations at Norse settlements in Denmark and Norway have uncovered ship fittings designed specifically for conversion to ice travel, with carbon dating placing them in the early 9th century. The physical challenge of these crossings cannot be overstated. To drag a longship across ice required extraordinary effort from every crew member. The vessels, while light for their size, still weighed several tons. The physical toll of hauling them across uneven frozen surfaces left marks on the skeletons of those who performed this labor. Archaeologists have identified distinctive wear patterns on spine and shoulder bones from burial sites associated with raiding crews, evidence of the repeated stress of pulling heavy loads with body harnesses. The sagas describe men binding their feet with seal skin to prevent slipping, wearing multiple layers of wool and fur against the bitter cold, and developing specific team techniques for coordinating their efforts when moving ships across particularly challenging ice formations. For the Saxons who witnessed these winter arrivals, the psychological impact cannot be overstated. These were deeply religious communities who interpreted unusual natural phenomena as divine messages. Alcuin of York, responding to the Lindisfarne raid, had already framed Viking attacks as punishment for sins, writing, "It is nearly 350 years that we and our forefathers have inhabited this lovely land, and never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered at the hands of a pagan race." How much more terrifying, then, to see these same pagans seemingly defy the laws of nature by traversing the frozen sea, an act that, in the Saxon mindset, could only be accomplished through supernatural assistance. The theological implications troubled Saxon religious leaders profoundly. If God had provided the winter ice as protection, what did it mean that pagans could use this very protection as a highway? Some clerics interpreted it as further evidence of divine punishment, arguing that God had given their enemies mastery over the elements that once shielded them. Others saw it as evidence of demonic assistance, believing that only through unholy alliances could men walk ships across the frozen sea. The most thoughtful theological responses, preserved in letters between monasteries, wrestled with deeper questions about divine providence and natural law, questioning whether Christians had grown complacent in their understanding of God's protection. Contemporary accounts describe local populations abandoning coastal settlements entirely during winter months, retreating inland to fortified positions previously considered unnecessary during the safe season. The psychological boundary of the winter sea had been breached, and with it, the sense of predictable cycles that had governed Saxon life. Every snowfall, every freezing night, now carried potential threat. The natural world itself seemed to have turned against them, colluding with these northern invaders who appeared to command elements that should have been barriers. The landscape of eastern England, with its extensive fenlands, river estuaries, and shallow coastal waters, was particularly vulnerable to winter crossings. In summer, these wetlands provided natural defensive barriers, difficult to navigate without local knowledge. In winter, when frozen solid, they became highways allowing Norse raiders to penetrate deep inland with remarkable speed. Monasteries that had been established in remote locations precisely because summer access was difficult found themselves suddenly exposed. Archaeological evidence shows that many of these communities erected hasty fortifications during this period. Earthworks, wooden palisades, and watchtowers appearing around settlements that had previously relied on natural isolation for protection. The initial Saxon response was spiritual rather than military. Church leaders called for prayers, fasting, and penance to appease divine wrath. King Ethelred of Northumbria ordered special liturgies to be performed in coastal churches, seeking supernatural protection where physical defenses had failed. Monastery treasures were moved inland, sometimes buried for safekeeping. But practical measures eventually followed. Coastal watchtowers were constructed, manned even through winter months. Messenger systems were established to provide early warning of approaching raiders. Some communities experimented with their own ice-breaking techniques, attempting to create moats of open water around vulnerable settlements. More intriguing are the accounts of Saxon efforts to understand and adopt Norse winter technology. The abbot of Jarrow sent envoys to Frisia, which had more regular contact with Norse traders, seeking information about the construction of ice runners and sledges. Archaeological evidence from mid-9th century Saxon settlements shows experimentation with ship modifications clearly inspired by Norse designs, though lacking the generations of refinement that made the originals so effective. There are even records of Saxon lords hiring Norse navigators as advisors, attempting to learn the secrets of winter mobility from the very people they feared. These technological exchanges were complicated by cultural barriers. Norse winter travel techniques were not merely technological, but embedded in cultural practices and specialized knowledge. Understanding of ice conditions that came from generations of experience, physical conditioning that began in childhood, team coordination developed through years of working together. Saxon attempts to replicate these capabilities achieved limited success, hampered by both the complexity of the knowledge required and cultural resistance to adopting pagan ways. Church authorities particularly objected to certain aspects of Norse winter travel that incorporated ritual elements, the traditional offerings made before venturing onto ice, the protective symbols carved into runners, the specific chants that coordinated group effort. The cultural exchange went beyond mere technology. The Viking winter crossings forced Saxon communities to reconsider fundamental assumptions about their relationship with the natural world. Where Christian teaching had emphasized humanity's dominion over nature through divine grace, the Norse approach demonstrated mastery through adaptation and innovation. Some ecclesiastical writers of the period note with alarm the growing admiration among young Saxon men for Norse capabilities, with one bishop lamenting that our youth now speak with reverence of the pagan's craft upon the frozen waters, as though the devil's servants were worthy of emulation. This admiration was not universal. For many Saxons, especially those in religious communities, the Norse winter crossings represented not merely a military threat, but a spiritual one. Their writings describe the Vikings as demonic figures emerging from the mist, their ships transformed into monstrous serpents sliding across the ice. One particularly vivid account from a monk at Crowland Abbey describes watching a Norse raiding party approach across the frozen fenlands. They came not as men, but as shadows, pulling their dragon-proud demons across God's frozen tiers, and where they passed, the ice did not crack, as though even the waters beneath feared to swallow such evil. The material consequences of these winter raids were devastating for coastal communities. Unable to predict when safety might be found, many smaller settlements were simply abandoned, their populations retreating to larger, more defensible inland locations. Archaeological evidence shows a distinct shift in settlement patterns during this period, with coastal sites showing signs of hasty abandonment and inland communities experiencing rapid growth. Church records note the relocation of religious communities from exposed coastal monasteries to protected inland sites, often accompanied by the transfer of relics and treasures that had once drawn pilgrims to the coast. The economic impact reverberated through Saxon society. Coastal trade, already disrupted by summer raiding, now faced year-round uncertainty. Markets that had operated continuously were now seasonal or relocated inland, increasing costs for merchants and consumers alike. Salt production, a critical coastal industry providing both food preservation and valuable trade goods, was particularly affected. Archaeological evidence shows many salt-making sites along the Lincolnshire and Norfolk coasts abandoned during this period, with production shifting to less efficient inland locations using salt springs rather than seawater evaporation. These economic dislocations created ripple effects throughout Saxon society, contributing to the instability that would eventually allow Norse settlers to establish permanent territories. For the Norse, the success of their winter expeditions opened new strategic possibilities. What had perhaps begun as experiments in extending the raiding season became a fundamental advantage. Records from Irish monasteries, which maintained more consistent chronicles during this period, described Norse winter kings who established temporary camps on frozen harbors, using the ice as both platform and protection. These winter bases allowed them to strike deeper inland than summer raids permitted, as frozen rivers and marshes became highways rather than obstacles. The psychological advantage was equally valuable, their ability to appear when least expected, from directions thought impossible, contributed to the supernatural aura that many contemporary accounts attribute to them. Norse winter expeditions evolved distinct characteristics from their summer counterparts. They tended to be smaller, more mobile forces, emphasizing speed over overwhelming numbers. They targeted different resources, while summer raids focused on portable wealth like precious metals and religious artifacts. Winter expeditions often prioritized food stores, livestock, and hostages who could be ransomed. This practical approach reflected the different challenges of winter operations. Heavy loads were more difficult to transport across ice, and the return journey required careful planning around changing ice conditions. Archaeological evidence from winter raiding camps shows they were deliberately temporary, designed for rapid establishment and equally quick abandonment as conditions changed. The full extent of these winter crossings is difficult to quantify, as many likely went unrecorded in the chaos of the period. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, our most comprehensive source for this era, has significant gaps during the mid-9th century when winter raids would have been at their height. What we can trace, however, is their gradual evolution from pure raiding expeditions to something more complex. By the 850s, Norse winter parties were sometimes remaining into spring, establishing seasonal settlements that became precursors to more permanent colonization efforts. Contemporary Frankish records provide additional perspective as Charlemagne's successors monitored Norse activities with growing concern. Royal correspondence describes diplomatic efforts to gather intelligence about winter raiding techniques, with Frankish emissaries sent to both Saxon and Norse territories seeking information. Defensive instructions issued to Frankish coastal commanders show increasing sophistication in winter preparations, suggesting knowledge transfer between affected regions. By the 860s, Frankish coastal defenses included specialized winter components, designated ice watch stations, maintained channels of open water around important harbors, and reserves of specifically trained troops familiar with fighting on frozen surfaces. The Heimskringla, a much later Norse source compiled by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, contains saga material describing these winter expeditions in heroic terms. While historically unreliable in specifics, these accounts capture something of the Norse perspective on these journeys. They emphasize not just the martial aspects, but the extraordinary challenges overcome, the skill needed to judge ice conditions, the endurance required to haul ships across frozen expanses, the navigation expertise to find destinations in the featureless white of winter seascapes. In these stories, the winter crossing becomes a test of worth, separating exceptional leaders from ordinary men. The sagas preserve tales of specific techniques developed for these crossings. They describe methods for distributing weight across weak ice, specialized formations for moving ships that placed strongest men at critical positions, and communication systems using horns and flags that worked in winter conditions when voices might be lost to howling winds. They record the development of ice-sounding techniques, where specialists would test the ice ahead of the main party using specific tools and reading subtle signs to identify dangerous areas. Most intriguingly, they mention dedicated pathfinders, men with particular talent for identifying optimal routes across frozen seascapes, whose status within raiding parties reflected their critical importance to the expedition's success. Archaeological evidence provides tangible confirmation of these winter activities. Excavations at several sites along Britain's eastern coast have uncovered Norse artifacts in contexts clearly dating to winter occupations, ice spikes designed to improve traction, specialized tools for breaking through frozen surfaces, remnants of temporary shelters constructed to withstand winter conditions. Perhaps most telling are the modifications found on recovered ship components, showing the attachment points for runners that would transform boats into massive sledges capable of gliding across frozen surfaces when water travel became impossible. Scientific analysis of these artifacts reveals sophisticated understanding of materials' properties. The metal fittings used to reinforce ships for ice travel show careful selection of iron with specific carbon content, harder than standard fittings to withstand the abrasion of ice contact. Wood selection for runners demonstrates equally careful consideration, with particular tree species chosen for their combination of strength and low friction against ice. Some recovered runners show evidence of specialized treatments, application of animal fats with particular freezing properties, careful polishing techniques that reduced drag, protective coatings that prevented moisture absorption that would increase friction. As decades passed, the initial shock of Norse winter mobility gradually transformed into grim familiarity. By the mid-9th century, Saxon communities had developed more effective responses. Coastal alarm systems became more sophisticated, with signal fires positioned to provide warning of approaching raiders, regardless of season. Physical defenses evolved to address the specific threats posed by winter attacks, including ice moats maintained through constant braking and defensive positions situated to take advantage of winter terrain. Some communities even attempted to weaponize the ice itself, creating deliberate weak points to trap unwary raiders. Perhaps most importantly, Saxon military organization adapted to the year-round threat. The Fyrd, the traditional levy of free men called to military service, had traditionally operated primarily in summer months when agricultural work allowed for extended absences. Now, specialized winter defense forces were established in vulnerable regions, maintained through royal decree and local taxation. The Burgel Heidige, a document from Alfred the Great's reign listing defensive burhs, fortified settlements, across Wessex, makes specific mention of winter garrisons stationed at coastal positions regardless of season. Alfred the Great's military reforms, traditionally viewed primarily as responses to land-based threats, included significant elements addressing winter defense. His reorganization of coastal watch systems created overlapping zones of responsibility, ensuring continuous monitoring even in harsh winter conditions. His naval innovations, including larger ships designed on modified Norse principles, included specific adaptations for winter operations, reinforced hulls capable of breaking through thin ice, modified steering systems that functioned in partially frozen waters, and design elements that facilitated conversion to sledge mode when necessary. The chronicles and sagas contain accounts of increasingly sophisticated engagements as Saxon defenders became more adept at winter warfare. The Battle of Inglefield in 870, while part of the larger Great Heathen Army campaign, included elements fighting across frozen marshland, with Saxon forces using their growing knowledge of winter terrain to ambush Norse raiders attempting to use frozen waterways as access routes. The Norse still maintained technological advantage in winter mobility, but the element of surprise had diminished, and with it, some of their tactical superiority. Contemporary accounts describe evolving tactics on both sides. Norse raiders developed methods for testing potentially hostile shorelines before committing their main forces, using small advance parties to identify defensive preparations. They created specialized roles within raiding parties, scouts who would race ahead on skates or skis to provide warning of defensive positions, specialists who could quickly assess ice conditions, designated rear guards who would cover retreating forces by destroying ice bridges behind them. Saxon defenders similarly adapted, developing ambush techniques specifically for frozen terrain, methods for monitoring ice conditions to predict likely approach routes, and systems for rapidly concentrating defenders at threatened points. As the initial raids evolved into more permanent Norse presence in Britain, with the establishment of the Danelaw and settlement of Norse communities across northern and eastern regions, the technology and techniques of winter crossing became part of the shared knowledge of the island. Archaeological evidence from late 9th and early 10th century settlements shows hybrid approaches to winter travel, combining Norse ice navigation techniques with Saxon shipbuilding traditions. Place name evidence also reveals this transfer of knowledge, with Old English terms for winter harbors and ice roads incorporating Norse linguistic elements. The settlement patterns of Norse communities in eastern England reflected their winter mobility capabilities. Unlike earlier Saxon settlements, which had often been situated with summer navigation as the primary consideration, Norse settlements frequently show positioning that optimized winter access routes. Archaeological excavations reveal infrastructure specifically designed for winter operations, specialized docking facilities that accommodated both open water and ice approaches, storage facilities positioned for easy loading under winter conditions, defensive arrangements that considered frozen approaches, as well as water routes. These settlements became nodes in a winter transportation network that fundamentally altered the regional geography, creating new patterns of movement and connection. What began as a terrifying invasion technique eventually became incorporated into the fabric of daily life in regions with mixed Norse and Saxon populations. The Domesday Book, compiled 2 centuries later in 1086, contains references to winter routes in eastern England that followed ancient Norse paths across seasonally frozen fenlands and estuaries. Local governance structures in these regions included provisions for maintaining these routes, showing how thoroughly the Norse approach to winter mobility had been absorbed into the landscape. Cultural integration appeared in other forms as well. Winter festivals in regions of Norse settlement incorporated elements of both traditions, with Christian observances adopting aspects of Norse winter celebrations. Linguistic evidence shows the adoption of Norse terminology for winter conditions and activities, with Old English incorporating words for specific ice types, winter travel techniques, and seasonal activities that had no previous equivalents. Material culture shows similar hybridization, with distinctive Norse-influenced winter clothing styles appearing in regions of settlement, combining elements from both traditions to create new approaches to cold weather protection. The winter crossings also left their mark on cultural memory and folklore. Anglo-Saxon poetry from the period contains increasingly frequent references to ice and winter journeys, themes previously rare in the tradition. The epic poem Beowulf, while set in Scandinavia rather than Britain, includes vivid descriptions of ice-flecked seas and winter-bound waters that some scholars believe reflect contemporary anxiety about Norse winter mobility. Later medieval ballads and folk tales from Britain's eastern regions often feature supernatural figures who travel across frozen waters, perhaps distant echoes of the shock experienced by those first Saxon witnesses. Storytelling traditions in affected regions preserved memories of the winter crossings long after they had ceased to be a military threat. Local legends along Britain's eastern coast told of ghost ships that could be seen sliding across frozen marshes on winter nights, their phantom crews eternally repeating their raids. Village traditions included ceremonial winter watches on certain dates, symbolic reenactments of ancient vigilance. Place names preserved the memory of specific incidents: Viking Mere, Northman's Ice, Harrowing Point, geographical features whose official names encoded historical trauma. These cultural memories remained vivid long after the actual events had faded from living memory, a testament to their psychological impact. Religious interpretation of the winter crossings evolved as well. Initial responses framed the Norse ability to traverse frozen seas as evidence of demonic assistance, but as Christianity eventually spread to Norse communities themselves, new narratives emerged. By the 10th century, when Norse rulers in Britain began converting to Christianity, church chronicles sometimes reinterpreted the earlier winter crossings as demonstrations of exceptional human ingenuity rather than supernatural intervention. A subtle but significant shift that allowed these events to be incorporated into a Christian worldview without the earlier apocalyptic overtones. This theological reinterpretation reflected broader changes in medieval Christianity's approach to technology and natural knowledge. Early medieval religious thought had often viewed technical innovation with suspicion, particularly when it came from non-Christian sources. The eventual acceptance of Norse winter techniques as legitimate knowledge rather than demonic assistance paralleled similar evolutions in Christian attitudes toward other forms of expertise, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, initially regarded with suspicion when derived from non-Christian traditions, but gradually incorporated into a Christian intellectual framework as natural knowledge rather than forbidden arts. The environmental conditions that made these winter crossings possible were themselves transitory. The early medieval period witnessed significant climate fluctuations, with the relative warmth of the 8th and early 9th centuries gradually giving way to colder conditions in the 10th and 11th. Paradoxically, this cooling initially facilitated winter raids by creating more extensive sea ice, but eventually, as conditions grew even harsher during the onset of the Little Ice Age, the extreme winter conditions made even Norse winter mobility techniques less reliable. The sagas record increasing instances of expeditions lost to sudden ice breakups or unexpected storms, suggesting changing environmental realities. Climate historians studying this period have identified a pattern of increasing weather volatility rather than simple cooling, more extreme fluctuations that made ice conditions less predictable and therefore more dangerous. Ice core samples from Greenland show evidence of this climatic instability, with rapid temperature shifts becoming more common in the late 9th and early 10th centuries. These conditions would have complicated winter crossings, requiring even greater expertise to judge when ice would bear weight and when it might fracture unexpectedly. Archaeological evidence shows technological responses to these changing conditions. More sophisticated ice testing tools, modified runners designed for varying ice types, improved emergency equipment for crews caught in dangerous conditions. By the late 10th century, the political landscape had shifted dramatically. The Norse were no longer outsiders, but integral parts of Britain's power structure, with their own kingdoms established and complex relationships with remaining Saxon realms. Winter mobility remained a military advantage, but increasingly it served trade and communication, rather than raiding. The descendants of those first raiders who shocked the Saxons by crossing the frozen sea now use those same techniques to maintain connections between scattered settlements during winter months, to transport goods when summer shipping lanes were closed, to administer territories that would otherwise be isolated by winter conditions. The evolution from raiders to settlers brought with it changes in how winter mobility was viewed and employed. Archaeological evidence shows increasing investment in permanent winter infrastructure, maintained ice roads connecting settlements, designated winter harbors with specialized facilities, waymarkers, and shelters positioned along common routes. Legal codes from the Danelaw regions include provisions for winter travel rights, regulations for maintaining common ice roads, and procedures for rescuing travelers in distress. Evidence of winter mobility becoming integrated into normal civil administration rather than remaining a specialized military capability. As Norse and Saxon communities gradually merged through intermarriage and cultural exchange, winter travel techniques became part of a shared heritage rather than a dividing line between cultures. The distinctions that had once seemed so stark between those who feared the frozen sea and those who mastered it blurred across generations. Descendants of Saxon communities adopted Norse approaches to winter mobility, while Norse communities incorporated Saxon administrative structures and religious practices. By the early 11th century, the winter crossing had transformed from shocking invasion technique to unremarkable seasonal adaptation, its revolutionary impact absorbed into the everyday fabric of life. The final chapter in this story came with the Norman conquest of 1066, which brought a new ruling elite with different military traditions. The Normans, themselves descendants of Norse settlers in France, had largely abandoned their ancestors' winter seafaring techniques in favor of cavalry-centered warfare. Under their rule, the specialized knowledge of ice navigation and winter crossing began to fade from active practice, though it remained in local memory and folklore. The extensive drainage of Britain's eastern fenlands in subsequent centuries further reduced the relevance of these techniques as the frozen waterways that had once served as winter highways disappeared from the landscape. The Norman administrative system, with its emphasis on centralized control and standardized practices, had little place for the specialized local knowledge that had made winter crossings possible. Winter travel became increasingly terrestrial rather than maritime, following maintained roads rather than opportunistic ice routes. Maritime activity returned to more conventional seasonal patterns with reduced winter operations. The distinctive hybrid maritime culture that had emerged in eastern England, combining Norse and Saxon elements, gradually faded into local tradition rather than living practice. Environmental changes accelerated this transition. The continuing drainage of fenlands, begun under Saxon administration but greatly expanded during Norman rule, transformed the landscape of eastern England. Areas that had once been seasonal wetlands, freezing into navigable plains during winter, became permanent agricultural land. The frozen waterways that had once served as winter highways disappeared, replaced by drainage channels and managed fields. The very geography that had made winter crossings so strategically significant was gradually erased by human intervention, a process that would continue for centuries. Today, as archaeologists and historians piece together the fragmentary evidence of these winter crossings, we can appreciate both their practical significance and their profound psychological impact. For the Saxons, the appearance of Norse raiders walking across the frozen sea represented not merely a military threat, but a conceptual one, a challenge to their understanding of natural boundaries and seasonal rhythms. For the Norse, these winter expeditions demonstrated their remarkable adaptability and technological innovation, qualities that would enable their influence to spread far beyond their northern homeland. Modern archaeological techniques continue to uncover new evidence of these winter activities. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified the remains of temporary winter camps beneath agricultural fields along Britain's eastern coast. Marine archaeology has recovered ship components modified for ice travel from harbor silts and river estuaries. DNA analysis of skeletal remains from battlefield burials has helped identify the composition of raiding parties, confirming the presence of individuals from diverse Norse regions brought together in winter expeditions. Environmental archaeology has reconstructed the landscape conditions that made these crossings possible, using pollen samples, soil analysis, and hydrological modeling to recreate the frozen waterways that once formed winter highways. The legacy of these winter crossings extends beyond the immediate historical context. They represent a pivotal moment in European maritime history, when human ingenuity overcame what had previously been considered insurmountable natural barriers. They demonstrate how technological advantage, even in seemingly simple forms, can reshape power relationships between cultures. Perhaps most importantly, they remind us that history is made not just through dramatic battles and political decisions, but through the accumulated weight of innovations and adaptations to environmental challenges. As we look back across the centuries at those Saxon witnesses on the shore, watching in disbelief as Norse warriors and their ships emerged from the winter mist, we can recognize a moment when one world's limitations were revealed to be another world's opportunities. The frozen sea, transformed from barrier to highway, stands as a powerful metaphor for how differently cultures can perceive and interact with the same natural phenomena. In that moment of first contact of impossible ships sliding across solid water, we can see the beginning of a cultural exchange that would eventually reshape the British Isles, creating something new from the meeting of Norse and Saxon worlds. Today, as we face our own environmental challenges and uncertainties, there may be wisdom in remembering both the Saxon certainty that winter seas meant safety and the Norse determination to challenge that assumption. Neither perspective was entirely right or wrong, merely incomplete. The true lesson of the winter crossings may be that adaptation, innovation, and the willingness to question established boundaries remain essential human qualities, as vital now as they were when the first long ship slid across the frozen sea, bringing with it both destruction and transformation, ending one era and beginning another. The winter crossings remind us that technological innovation often appears first in unexpected contexts, not in formal research but in practical responses to immediate challenges. The Norse did not set out to revolutionize maritime technology. They simply sought to extend their mobility into seasons previously considered impassable. Their innovations emerged from collective experience rather than individual genius, from accumulated knowledge passed between generations rather than sudden inspiration. This pattern of innovation, practical, collective, incremental, has been repeated countless times throughout human history, often overlooked in favor of more dramatic narratives of individual discovery. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of these winter crossings lies in how they changed perceptions of possibility. Before the Norse demonstrated otherwise, the frozen winter sea represented an absolute boundary in the Saxon worldview, a limitation imposed by nature itself. After the Norse revelations, it became simply another challenge to be overcome through human ingenuity. This conceptual shift from accepting natural limitations to seeing them as problems awaiting solutions represents one of the most significant transformations in human relationships with the environment. The descendants of both those shocked Saxon witnesses and the Norse innovators who stunned them would go on to reshape their world based on this altered perspective, beginning the long process of environmental modification that continues to this day.